Hi, my name is Chloe Houseman. I'm one of the paper conservators here at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. I just started here last December, so I'm one of the newer conservators on the team, but I'm already having a great time. If anyone has any specific questions right off the bat, we can start with those. If not, I can just talk a little bit more generally about paper conservation. Yeah, just keep questions coming. I'll try and hit them all as I go through. If I skip someone, please either type it again or say, hey, you missed me. So that's fine. I guess I'll just start with a little bit of an introduction into paper conservation. For anyone who doesn't know or maybe doesn't know a lot about exactly what conservation is or what conservators do, we're kind of a little bit like doctors for paper, if that makes sense. Oh yeah, and Diani just mentioned in the chat that this is being recorded, so yeah, if you miss something or have to go get a drink, don't worry, you can hear all of my cool words later. All right, so paper conservation, as I was just about to say, is the very basic idea is we work to conserve and repair historic papers or artworks on paper. There are different specialties that sort of fall under the paper conservation umbrella. I'm a paper conservator, so my main specialty is flat paper, so that would include, like letters, unbound documents, prints, drawings, paintings on paper, posters. If it's flat paper, it is in my wheelhouse. But there are also book conservators who specialize more in bound materials like books or pamphlets or anything that's multiple sheets of paper sort of bound together. We also have photo conservators here at the center who deal with all kinds of different photographs. So if you have questions about those other two specialties, I may be able to answer, but I am definitely more knowledgeable about flat paper conservation. So does anyone have any questions about, specific things conservators do, or, what the day-to-day for a conservator is? I guess I could just talk about that a little bit, but I'll answer specific questions as we go through as well. Generally, I'm treating several objects at any one time, so I'll be doing a number of different treatment steps on different things day-to-day, in addition to, other sort of more mundane office work. Oh, just got a question from Brian. Thank you, Brian. The question is, do I recommend sunlight to kill organisms on paper? I mean, that's an interesting question. If you have any kind of mold growth, that's clearly a problem. How do I deal with mold? Great. So these questions kind of go together a little bit. What we would do would be mold remediation with a HEPA vacuum to, get any spores if you suspect you have. But that's more for inactive mold, so mold residue and spores that are no longer actively growing. If you have active mold that's or something that's still currently wet, there are other more involved treatment steps there. But if you have something that has mold, like older mold, you could just brush it off, but anything more intensive, I would recommend bringing to a conservator. How do I know if it's active mold? Generally, if there's a smell, you can sort of tell. And again, if something is actively damp, or if there are, sort of larger, more three-dimensional mold growth, if something's pretty dry and has been that way for a while, it's less likely to be active, but can still cause, respiratory issues if you have a sensitivity to mold or any sort of particulate sensitivity. So that we really recommend, getting someone professionally to remediate that. Oh, just got a question. If I have a collection that just came in that has obvious bug damage, what first steps do you take? Well, first step would be to ascertain if there are still bugs in it. If there are still, bugs hanging out in the collection, we would, well, there's a couple of different options. We have chemical options, but more often we would freeze the collection to kill any sort of remaining life that would be there. So that we have specialized freezers for this purpose that minimize wetness and sort of remove humidity as they freeze, and then we can sort of unfreeze them and bring them up to temp and deal with whatever damage is left there later. Let's see. Oh, we just got a couple more questions. Oh, how long do we freeze them for? I would have to check on that. If you want a specific answer to that question, my email is visible on the screen right now. Feel free to send me that question, and I will look up the specifics and get back to you, because I just cannot remember off the top of my head. Just got a question about union skin paper from the 1930s and how to preserve it. I'm actually not sure what you mean by union skin paper. Jeremy, if you could be a little bit more specific, I might be able to help. And again, if someone has a question that I can't answer off the top of my head, please feel free to email me and I will get back when I've had a little bit more time to, do some research or figure things out. Okay, just got a question from Caroline about 125-year-old court documents. Many of them are in their original folded state. Should they be unfolded? Well, if they were folded originally, I would say that has sort of informational value for the papers. If that was the way they were meant to be presented, I would say keep them folded. Sort of like you wouldn't, press a pamphlet flat just to have it open. It's sort of the same kind of idea. Like if we have a folio or letter that's been folded and that's clearly the intention, we would not flatten that crease. If they're safe to open, the paper's not brittle and it's strong enough to unfold to be viewed, that's fine. If not, and there's an issue opening it, you can always bring it in for conservation treatment or digitization, so that it would be, sort of opened once, photographed, and you would have access to that information. So that kind of depends on the state of the documents. Oh, and Jeremy meant onion skin. That clarifies things a little bit. For onion skin paper, my recollection is that it's just very sort of thin, and the thinness is really what would cause problems more than anything else. So if it's my guess is that common condition issues you might be encountering would be, rips, tears, cracks, that kind of thing. For most flat paper objects, I recommend, if you want to keep it in good condition, get a nice housing, a nice, acid-free folder or something like that to keep it from, having more acidity imparted into it from its environment, which can cause embrittlement over time. But if onion skin if you had a specific piece of onion skin that needed help, I would, if it had a lot of tears that needed repairing, that would require some conservation treatment. Yeah, a lot of papers, especially from about 1850 on, are a lot more brittle than pre-1850 papers, just because before around that time period, most paper was made out of non-wood pulp fibers, so things like linen or hemp or jute or other non-wood materials were used, whereas after 1850-ish, when the chemical pulping process really got going, most papers are wood-based, which over time just naturally become more acidic, unless they can be treated in a very specific, expensive way to remove lignin, which is what becomes acidic, or it's the component of the wood that becomes acidic over time, but that is not the case for most papers. So yeah, papers from the 1930s might have issues related to just their makeup. Oh, new question. Is there a safe way to remove old tape adhesive residue from paper, short of taking it to a conservator? I mean, there are definitely tools at our disposal as conservators, yeah, but a lot of that involves solvents that either are not safe to use in the amounts we would use or the concentrations we would use, and also it requires sort of a more knowledge of solvent use and also a fume hood for the most part to be safe, to avoid breathing too much solvent in the air. So, I mean, if you've got old tape and the carrier, so the plastic is coming off and that just pops off safely, you can remove that, I suppose. That would be fine. But as far as adhesive, I would really recommend seeing a conservator for that. That's a pretty tenacious problem. Okay. Oh, is archival document repair tape the best thing to use to repair old newspapers? Also, when storing, should tissue be used between every page? I would not recommend using any kind of tape, basically ever, for anything, even if it is marketed as archival, especially to use to repair documents or anything like that. We really don't use tapes at all in conservation, and even if the tape is marketed as archival or acid-free, there's a lot of sort of shenanigans around, oh, it's acid-free at time of purchase, but sort of like paper, how I was talking about earlier, may become acidic over time. And that's not to say that all tapes are this way, but the adhesives are usually not ideal. So I would recommend against any kind of on-the-market repair tapes that are marketed for conservation. And yeah, you could interleave newspapers with some sort of acid-free paper, just because that would help just absorb some of the acidity from the newspaper, which, as you may have guessed, is wood pulp and highly acidic, just because it's such poor quality, because it's really meant to be ephemera, not really meant or designed to last. So newspapers are difficult. Even treating small clippings to get them to a place where they're stable and strong can be quite difficult. All right, another question. What is the intention with keeping pamphlets folded? Simply preserving the original intent in how it is observed? Yeah, we generally like to try and keep something called information, as much informational value as possible. For instance, if you have a bunch of sketches that an artist made with little tack holes that the artist themselves put there, we wouldn't repair those, because those tell you a little bit about the artist's working process and how they used the paper. Same with pamphlets. It was meant to be a pamphlet, so it should stay that way, just to because that gives you some information about, again, how it was supposed to be used and what its purpose was. All right, next question. For books really, I guess that means very, very damaged by cigarette smoke, any tips on removing the smoke smell from the covers and spine? Okay. That's tough, because the question asker also says that the smell is now gone from the book pages after letting them sit in the fume hood with the fan running for a little over a week and interleaving microchamber paper, which is generally what I would recommend. Microchamber paper is a paper that kind of draws out impurities and scents and other environmental damage, like acidity, to sort of put it in a simplified way. And yeah, I would have recommended having it in a fume hood. It might be tough for the covers and spine just because they are thicker, so it might just be additional time. And also, if you put microchamber paper, in contact with the covers and spine on either side and change it out more frequently, that might help. But it might just be a time issue. Okay, someone's got some books that went through a fire before being donated. Are the books just beyond repair? Most of the page edges are charred, and definitely the covers. Nope, I actually recently did a condition report for some documents that had been singed. So we can't reconstruct anything that's been lost in a fire, but as long as the paper is still there, we can reinforce the singed areas and clean off any smoke or soot, or if not completely, just reduce it through surface cleaning. So I wouldn't say those books are beyond repair. I mean, it certainly depends on the degree of the charring. If they're just sort of lumps of coal, then maybe not so much. But there are some really incredible treatments that we can do for things that are brittle, regardless of the source of the embrittlement. Oh, where do we buy blotting paper? That's a better question for our registrar than me, unfortunately, because we certainly use it, but I'm not on the acquisitions end of things, so to speak. Oh, Audrey asks, do we use rice or wheat paste and paper to mend tears? Yes, we do. We use something called wheat starch paste and very thin Asian papers, usually from Japan or Korea, that are, have very high strength, but they're very thin. And we like this because the papers are truly archival. They're not made from wood pulp, so they won't degrade over time. And the wheat starch paste is reversible, so it's very easy to, if you mend something and you don't like the way it looks, you can take it off. Or if someone else, in the future, say the paper of the object darkens and the repair looks bad, it can be taken off more easily. Okay. Oh, if you can't use tape to repair tears in newspaper or other acidic paper, what would you use to hold the paper together? Yeah, this is sort of goes hand in hand with the last question. We would still use wheat starch paste and Japanese or other Asian papers. That's sort of our go-to quote-unquote tape that we use because it is archival, but it's not, you can't really buy it ready-made. It's not like you can get a gummed tape and re-wet and just adhere, or a standard pressure-sensitive tape where it's already sticky and you can just set it down, unfortunately, so that's a little bit more involved. Okay, oh, if you have to store documents vertically, what is the best way to do so? Well, it depends on the document, I would say. If these are, oversized documents, a lot of people, well, first of all, I'll say vertically is not ideal. If you can store something laying down, that's great. I understand not everyone has that space or ability, but just first off the bat, I would recommend, having documents totally supported vertically or horizontally, at least for oversized. It's pretty common in archives to have documents in folders, which are then in larger boxes. But the one thing with that I would say is either have your box pretty full, not jam-packed, but full enough that the folders don't slump, or if the box isn't going to be full, create some sort of spacer so that the folders can then, be kind of standing pretty upright. Excuse the cough, I'm just coming off a little cold. So for oversized documents, I would say there's a lot of people who have been using magnets for mounting paper documents. So if you have a large magnetic surface, that would be one option for things that are larger. But like I said, for smaller archival documents, vertically in folders would be fine. A lot of smaller archives and places will use filing cabinets, which is not ideal, but pretty okay. As long as the folders are pretty good quality, that's going to be a little bit more important. Okay, Brittany asks, I have some thin archival quality tape. Is that adequate for quick repairs? Again, I would really not recommend using any kind of tape ever. And I know it's tough because, not everyone has the time or the means to bring something with just a small tear in for conservation treatment, but in lieu of tape, I would almost recommend something like, a Mylar sleeve if something's got tears that are large enough that you're concerned about them catching or getting larger, because once you put the tape on there for the, excuse me again, once the tape is on there, it'll be a lot more difficult to get off usually. So in lieu of repairs, I would recommend better housing, which is usually a lot more accessible and most folks can find through archival and conservation supply stores, a variety of folders and sleeves. Excuse me, I should be muting when I cough. Okay, where did I leave off? Let's see. All right. Oh, next question. We have some older archival document boxes that have turned yellowish. Do they turn acidic over time, and should they be replaced? This is tricky to say without actually seeing the document boxes, because it could be either way. The document boxes might themselves be fine, but depending on what's stored in them, acidity from the documents themselves could have migrated to the box, or it could just be the box. But so that's difficult to tell. But if it is yellowed, it wouldn't hurt to replace, certainly, especially with a newer Hollinger or other truly archival box. But as long as you're not noticing any like specific degradation of the collections, like if these are older papers that you suspect are probably not wood pulp that aren't becoming more acidic, then it's likely that what's in the box and not in the objects. So are there types of damaged documents that you would not select for scanning digitization until conserved? Yes. I recently have done a couple of different conservation surveys, one of which with the goal of getting some data about what in a collection can and can't be digitized. And there are sort of levels of damage. There's, a degree of damage where it can be imaged. It would be nice to conserve, but with careful handling, it's fine. Sort of the next step up from that is, we can handle it. There may be some more loss, but it's doable. And then sort of the top tier is cannot be handled, cannot be imaged, must be conserved to be safely photographed at all whatsoever. So I would say, yeah, there are definitely some cases where something can't be digitized until it's been conserved. And this is especially true in cases where something may be folded, so information is obscured, or if it's in many pieces and it then becomes sort of a puzzle situation where you can't really parse what's happening until you put them back together again, or just even if something's extremely brittle and any kind of handling makes it difficult. I worked on a project at a different institution a little while ago with some heavily mold damaged documents that needed to be treated before they could be imaged, just because they were so powdery that you would look at them and they would basically disintegrate. So yes, it's definitely worthwhile to have documents that you may be concerned about conserved before digitizing them. Ooh, for a very small museum on a limited budget, what would be your recommended tools to always have? That's an interesting question. Let me think. First of all, I think, well, it's a good idea to have gloves accessible. Not like a white cotton situation, more like nitrile gloves. Although for the most part in conservation, we don't really wear gloves unless we're handling, either photographs or using chemicals that day. So careful handling can really go a long way, and also hand washing, which isn't really a tool, it's more of a suggestion. But some nitrile gloves are always good to have. I would always say, again, good housing can go a really long way. So if you just have some folders or sleeves at the ready for things that, you may wish you had the resources to conserve, but can't at that moment, just keeping it in a place where it's not going to become more damaged is really helpful as well. I also always recommend just a nice micro spatula. It makes it so much easier to lift papers and turn them and just handle them in a safe way. If you've got long nails, that can also sort of substitute, which is why I keep mine a bit longer. But yeah, generally micro spatulas are very useful. Oh, what is that? It's a micro spatula. Sorry, it's like a very tiny spatula. Basically, there's two ends, and they've got little flat bits where you can lift up paper without either crimping a corner or wrinkling it like you might a standard piece of paper on your desk where you sort of pinch it and pick it up. So it gives you access without causing more damage. Okay. All right, for large format maps, etc., that are too large for flat storage, in map cases, what diameter archival tube is recommended for rolling them on, and how should multiple maps be rolled on the same tube? That's a good question. Yeah, it's common to store oversized things rolled just because not a lot of people have the flat space required for these, especially maps that are really sizable. I know larger diameter is recommended. I would have to check specifically. I haven't treated any large maps in a while. So that would be another good thing to email me, and I can double check on that and get back to you, Michael. But yeah, you can roll multiple maps on the same tube. It's not ideal. I would recommend trying to keep it sort of one per tube, just because then there's less sort of slipping and sliding happening, and also it's easier to keep track of what you have. Because you don't want something to get wrapped around something else and then say, oh, where'd that map go? All right. Oh, Lisa asks, can I go into a little more detail on why tapes, post-it adhesive, etc. is bad when applied to paper items? Of course I can. I love to talk about how much I hate tape. Basically, a lot of common adhesives in, post-its or pressure-sensitive tapes, over time they degrade essentially and become very difficult to remove. Like a lot of the time you'll see older, essentially Scotch tape that has just turned this bright kind of amber yellow color, which is difficult, if not impossible, to completely remove. So you get a lot of staining. It can cause further damage to the paper. And also over time they fail. They're not great over time. Like, more often than not, when I see tapes, although this is certainly not always the case, but the carrier, so the plastic part that is actually holding a flap or tear together, has already popped off or just completely disintegrated because the adhesive has become so just hard and no longer sticky basically at all. So that's sort of the basic tape is bad lecture that I have. Let's see. Lisa says, the archival tape is barely adhesive and we only use it on the back of the articles. Unfortunately, we have thousands of them and it's probably our only option, but we will definitely try to use it more sparingly now. Yeah, I mean, I totally understand that everyone's got different abilities and different amounts of resources. So, of course, do what you have to do. Like, I can completely respect that, but it's just good to know what you're doing, and if you have other options, it's always good to look at those as well. All right, how do I take a picture/scan of a document that has been encapsulated by a conservator? How long is the encapsulation good? So, generally speaking, if we were going to photograph something that's been that we're going to encapsulate, we would do the photos before any type of encapsulation were to happen. Excuse me, I had the cough, so I muted myself. But if something is already in, a Mylar encapsulation and someone wants it to be photographed, it is more difficult to photograph things that are, kind of shinier. But I'm not a photographic expert, I will say, but I know we have a photo specialist in our studio, and he's got a number of things at his disposal that can sort of cut shine and reduce that. I know we use it a lot for things like case photographs that involve glass, so you want to be able to see the entire image without any kind of shine. So I'm not positive on exactly what the procedure there is specifically, but as far as how long is the encapsulation good, if it's good quality Mylar, for a good long while. Again, it might become yellowed or start to look bad if whatever it's encapsulating is acidic. But if it's encapsulating something that's pretty good quality, it can last for quite a long time. Oh, why do we not use gloves when handling paper? That's a great question. Well, one thing with paper is that it's delicate, so we really value having our tactile sense sort of as acute as possible while we're working. We want to avoid making any more rips or tears or damage, which is really easy to do sometimes. I mean, paper is stronger than most folks would think, but still it's kind of easy to make more damage, so we really want to be able to feel, you know, if something's going to give, or, oh, this feels very brittle, which is a little bit harder through a glove. So that's why we just really try to keep our hands clean, and, you know, it's really safer for the objects that way, unless, again, it's not safe for us to be handling something without gloves. For instance, if something's moldy, we would absolutely use gloves and other personal protective equipment, and also work in a fume hood to help, you know, keep us as conservators safe. Okay, what is the best storage option for very brittle, large format items such as maps, surveys, etc. when flat space is limited? Ooh, that's a toughie. I mean, I would still really say flat space, especially if they're brittle, because if something's brittle, I wouldn't recommend rolling it on a tube, because that could cause it to split or crack or have more damage. I mean, if it's available to you, I would recommend bringing larger brittle items in for conservation treatment. We have a number of treatments that can reinforce and strengthen brittle items, including washing, you know, and lining, which is essentially where we would adhere a large sheet of an Asian paper with wheat starch paste to the back of a paper to give it more strength overall, especially in cases where something is very brittle. So, you know, that is a tough one. I'm not sure what I would recommend outside of flat space, essentially. Oh, what glue and kind of paper do you use for the conservation of transparent paper? Well, I haven't personally treated anything transparent. I have recently worked on some things that are translucent. I worked over a year ago at a different institution on a number of blueprints, essentially, that were on this translucent sort of drafting paper, and for that what we used was a very thin Japanese tissue. It was like 3.5 grams per square meter, which is kind of a nonsense measurement, but it's very thin and sort of clear in the first place. We also super saturated the paper with adhesive, which sort of reduced the or it increased the transparency of the paper, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, Audrey asked about mold remediation. Oh, she also works as a conservator. She uses the HAPAVAC, sunshine, latex sponge, and sometimes alcohol to nullify mold spores while wearing a mask and gloves. I would like to know if these measures are some that you all do as well. There are so many ideas about so many areas of conservation. That's definitely true. There's always a lot we can learn from other conservators around the world. But yeah, HAPAVAC is great. You know, sunshine, also good. Although in that case, I would, you know, it's just important to be careful if something might have media that's light sensitive. You don't want to accidentally, you know, have something bleach when you don't want it to. Yeah, we would also use like a latex sponge, or, you know, natural rubber sponges as well to clean off mold residue. And yeah, alcohol is also a good way to sort of keep a document from getting wet again, because a lot of the time we will use water-based treatments, but water could possibly reactivate the mold. So yeah, it's a good idea to use something like that in a conservation setting to you know, counteract mold. So yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. And also mask and gloves, very important, especially with mold. Even if you aren't sensitive at the start, mold is something that you can become sensitized to over time. So even if you feel fine, it's important to really minimize your contact. All right, Mason asks, I have limited climate-controlled space for archival collections. Are there particular types of paper or photo collections that you would describe as better to store in non-air-conditioned spaces versus others? Well, first and foremost, I would say if you have climate-controlled space, put the photos in there first. Photos are generally more sensitive to temperature and humidity than paper, although paper is also pretty sensitive. But especially for photos, I would say you want to keep those temperature controlled as well. And if you have any film or negatives, those even more so, I would say you want to keep in a nice air-conditioned or temperature-controlled space. And just, whatever you can fit, but again, newer papers that are more likely to degrade might be more worthwhile, but then again, it's also, if you have older papers that are more valuable, you might want to put them there. It sort of depends on what you have in your collection. Oh, Sarah, I'm sorry that people yell at you for not using gloves. Yeah, tell them that a conservator told you that they're wrong. Oh, is it safe to use a home use type of steamer to flatten architectural drawings, blueprints, and maps? We do use water vapor a lot to humidify things to help them become flat, but we don't usually use steam or heat, although it's possible. But I would, especially if something's got some more complex sort of folds or tears or things that are causing it to not be flat, I would really recommend seeing a conservator about that. Sarah asked, what do you do when the iron gall ink is falling out of paper? Is there a way to stabilize it? Okay, first of all, for anyone who doesn't know, iron gall ink was the most common manuscript ink for a long time, hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's called iron gall ink because it's made from something called an oak gall, which you get from an oak tree, and it's got high iron content. So there are a lot of different recipes and ways of mixing up this ink, some of which are very high in iron, and over time what can happen is the iron can essentially, what it's doing is it's rusting. The ions are reducing to an unstable iron 2 ion from an iron 3, which are just two different types of iron. So when that happens, the ink itself becomes really brittle and starts to essentially eat through the paper, like Sarah said in her question. So what we would do is, first of all, avoid using any kind of water because water will exacerbate this. But we have a treatment that we do called a phytate treatment, which is where we use a chemical called calcium phytate to essentially remove all of the unstable iron ions from the paper. And this won't reverse the damage that's already been done. So if something's already got ink that's very brittle and is dropping out and just crumbling, that's not going to fix that, but it'll keep it from getting worse. So yes, to stabilize something that's gotten to that stage, we would usually mend it with a very thin Asian paper and wheat starch paste, similar to how we mend other things. If it's too unstable to be phytated, we would use a non-aqueous or non-water-based, mending method. So we would use a remoistenable or so a tissue that we can re-wet with something like ethanol to mend the brittle areas. I hope that answers your question. If that wasn't clear, please please ask me and I will clarify anything also, by the way. All right, Nicole says, I work with many books, some of them bound in leather. How can I keep red rot from spreading in the older editions? Okay, yeah, red rot is a big problem with books, and essentially it's your leather is kind of turning to dust a little bit. I would recommend if you can getting red volumes with red rot individual boxes to prevent them from rubbing up against other books, and if possible have them treated to consolidate the cover. So this won't reverse the red rot damage, but it'll keep any more of the cover from sort of coming off, if that makes sense. So that's a treatment that a book conservator could do. So that's not something I would routinely have on my plate because I'm not a book conservator, but I definitely know it's doable. How would you apply alcohol to a moldy book cover or text block, Q-tip, cloth, spray? I generally don't use alcohol in my mold remediation. For the most part, I'm using either sponges or just the HEPA-vac. But I have in the past treated moldy documents. So not a book cover in this case, again, because I don't really treat books. But individual moldy pieces of paper, I sprayed overall with an alcohol and adhesive mix to give them some overall strength again. So again, depending, there are different ways to do it. I would not recommend doing this yourself at home. If you have a moldy book cover that you want to clean, I would more so recommend just sort of wiping it gently with a dry cloth to get any mold residue off. Ooh, I've got a scenario. You open a flat file drawer with architectural drawings and discover that a rodent or rodents have invaded the drawer and left behind droppings and shredded some of the paper. How would you go about cleaning it up? Well, I mean, first of all, get those droppings out of there. Definitely just, I would remove all of the pieces of paper, try to gently brush any dirt or droppings off of them. If there are any rodents around, try and get those out of the picture somehow or other. If there is paper shreds and you can identify which piece they go to, I would either put those in little, plastic bags or small Mylar sleeves if you have them, and label which object they go with if there's a way to tell. If not, I would maybe retain them just together. And if you were to have conservation treatment done, some of that may be able to be reassembled. But if you can keep things together that you think go together, that would really be ideal in terms of recovering from something like that. Oh, Audrey asks, what is that chemical for ink stabilization? It's called calcium phytate. Oh, you're welcome, Mary. For large quantities of sheet music from the late 1800s and early 1900s, what kind of housing would you recommend? Archival supply companies offer polyester L-sleeves and envelopes. Would you say this is better than simply an oversized flat folder? Well, it depends on the size of the sheet music, I suppose. I'm picturing something sort of, a bit larger than a standard sheet of paper. For something like that, yeah, I would recommend individual folders. If something does have damage, you could put it in an L sleeve or something like that, but that's not necessary if they're in good condition. If they're a little larger than I'm thinking, then yes, a flat file would be good. But if they're on the smaller side, I would say folders in a box would be perfectly okay. Oh, Michael asks, how can I identify iron gall ink in my collections of 19th century documents if the ink has not begun to degrade in a noticeable manner? Well, I will say if it hasn't begun to degrade in a noticeable manner, you're probably fine. I totally understand wanting to know what you have on your hands, though. Iron gall ink has a couple of different degradation stages that I can describe for you and other folks who might be wondering about, is this iron gall? How do I know? What does it look like? Iron gall is, as we see it, when it's initially made, it's sort of a nice, true black ink, but as it ages, it becomes this like rich brown color. So brown inks, first of all, usually can be a warning sign. Like I mentioned, there's a couple of different stages of degradation. One of the early ones is haloing. So if you look at your writing and there's sort of a lighter brown halo around the darker brown ink, that's a good tip that you may have iron gall, because that's sort of the iron migrating further into the paper. So haloing is a common one. Also, if you see any cracks just in the areas of writing, that's sort of a further degradation stage. And then, of course, if you get what's called dropout, so imagine like where you've written, the ink has just completely dropped out of the paper, so it sort of starts to look a bit like paper lace. So there'll just be holes with maybe a bit of brown around the edges where the ink had been. But if your documents are older and you suspect they're iron gall but they're in good condition, they're likely to stay that way as long as you keep them in well-controlled storage. If they're not exposed to too much humidity, which can be a problem because, like I mentioned earlier, moisture and water can really be a big problem for iron gall because it'll really speed up that cool, essentially paper rust process. Oh, you are so welcome. Yeah, we treat a lot of iron gall here at the center. We've just gotten a pretty big project that involves just a lot of iron gall ink documents. So we're treating them a couple of different ways. Some of them we're phytating, some of them we're not, due to either solubility concerns or other issues. So those are just being mended with the very thin solvent remoistenable tissue, like I mentioned. But yeah, that'll be a really long, longer term project for us here at the center. All right, I think I'm caught up on questions at the moment. If anyone has anything else, please definitely drop it into the chat. Let me just see if there's anything maybe I could elaborate on a little bit. Oh, we got some people typing. Let's see. Oh, Denise. All right, what are the little reddish brown dots in many old documents? Could be mold, but based on what you're describing, it's more likely something that we call foxing. So what that is small, metal, usually iron inclusions in paper that over time rust and sort of have these little brownish red snowflake-like appearance. They're not a health concern or anything like that. They're just sort of aesthetically disruptive. It was common in the paper making process for either like tools to be made out of iron or just the water to have metal in it, so that would have caused the inclusions in paper, which, like, sort of similar to iron gall ink, basically rust over time and cause that gross look. Okay, do I recommend flattening papers that have been creased or folded when that is not how it was used? Yes, we will frequently flatten things that have been creased or crumpled or folded, especially if it's restricting use of that item. So if it's not lying flat like it should be, or if it's hard to see the text if there is any, or the image or what have you. Yeah, we have a number of different ways that we would flatten papers like that. Most commonly we would humidify it, so put it either in a humidity chamber or sort of other ways, but increase the humidity of the paper so it just relaxes, basically like a nice cool sauna, sort of. And then we would press it between blotters and underweight to get it flatter again. All right, when using Mylar L sleeves, would you recommend backing acidic single-side documents with acid-free tissue? Yeah, I would say, or it doesn't even have to be tissue, but if you in the sleeve include something buffered or non-acidic, that will sort of soak up some of the acidity, so to speak, which the sleeve will too. Over time, it'll yellow. I've actually done a little bit of research on Mylar and other types of plastic L sleeves, or well, not L sleeves in my case, they're specifically for comic books, which is one of my research interests. But yeah, the acidic paper will yellow the L sleeve over time, but the acid-free tissue might help a little. Again, it's tough when it's the object itself that's acidic and not anything that you can do with the storage. But then yeah, it would be good if feasible to then replace that with relative frequency, because that would sort of continuously remove acidity that is leaching out of the object. All right, I have an 80-year-old newspaper that has tears and flaking at the edges. How do I repair the newspapers without using any tape? The newspapers are creased and folded as well. That's a real tough one. I mean, my first recommendation would be bring it to a conservator. Any kind of really brittle paper like that, I would really say would be worthwhile to have seen by somebody. Just because, like I said, tape is going to really cause more damage than it's going to help, especially with something that's already so damaged in the first place. We could, flatten them and get them in a better condition, but also a lot of newspapers will have digital archives where you can get a copy. So unless this particular newspaper has, a sentimental value, or if you're just more interested in the information housed there, you can often get, some sort of print version on a slightly nicer paper from the particular newspaper archive. All right, Audrey says, when parchment starts to draw up, do you try to rehumidify? When you say draw up, oh, do you mean dry up? That would be my guess. So I'm gonna go with that. Yeah, well, parchment is really tricky, and for anyone who's not aware, when we say parchment, we do mean sort of a writing surface that is made from an animal skin. A lot of people will call different types of papers parchment, but true parchment is made from skins. And these are very, what we call hygroscopic, so they're very reactive to water, essentially. So it's easy for them to become wavy or just react to different environmental factors. And that's that's really kind of a problem. So yeah, we would rehumidify sometimes, but not too much. It's really a pretty careful balancing act when it comes to parchment. You want to limit moisture, but sometimes moisture is necessary to do things like flatten creases or fix problems caused by other high humidity in the past. Do we use UV to determine mold areas, ink corrosion, and foxing formation? Yes, ultraviolet light is a common way to look at things to figure out exactly what's happening. It can often highlight things like ink corrosion, etc. Oh yeah, we are getting close to the end. Man, time flies. Time flies when you're having fun, folks. UV is a common tool, and can also, if you have iron gall ink that's very faded, can, in an imaging perspective, really enhance that and make it more legible, which is just kind of cool, I think. Sarah asks, is the deacidification spray safe for the paper? I'm not sure which spray specifically you mean, and I know in the past conservators have used things like Bookkeeper, etc. I haven't had a lot of first-hand experience with anything like that, so I'm not the most knowledgeable, unfortunately. But I would say anything where you don't know exactly what the constituent chemicals are, I would be wary of. So anything that's proprietary and they don't tell you, this is made of X, Y, Z, I would be careful. That's why a lot of conservators will do research to try and figure out what's in something. But if it is proprietary, they can change the formulation at any time, basically. So we try to use things where it's like, yes, I know exactly what this is. I can tell you 100% of the things that are in it. It can be tricky. All right, can you use everyday sheet protectors that you can buy from a local store for documents? You can. I wouldn't say that they're bad. I've definitely seen them used. The majority of plastic sleeves are either polyester, which is the sort of common name for Mylar, polypropylene, or polyethylene, and these are all pretty good, actually. Polypropylene and polyethylene sleeves, which my guess is that your common ones are going to be polypropylene. This isn't very important. This is just something I know a lot about. But they're going to be fine over time. Just they're not going to hold their shape as well, so they might become wavier. They might yellow a little bit more and become discolored. So it's not ideal. I would generally recommend, if the paper isn't damaged, just a nice folder, which you can buy from. I think Diani put some information further up in the chat of different archival supply places where you can get folders like that. All right. Yeah, you're so welcome. I think we're just about getting towards the end. If anyone has any questions they weren't able to ask me, my email's on the screen right now. Please feel free to write me any follow-ups or additional things you didn't get to ask. Oh, you're welcome. Thanks so much. Oh, you're also welcome. It was lovely. Oh, great. I'm glad you found it answered questions and was informative. I appreciate that. All right. I'm going to sign off now. Bye, guys. It was really nice talking.